Let's make sure this is coming down. All right, hey Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek and I'm here today with our e-learning lesson for Tuesday, March 31st. So we're going to start today with just a little Google Slides deck that I thought would be helpful in just going over, what happened yesterday, and looking over some of the journal prompts and then previewing what we're going to do today before we actually jump in to class. All right, so yesterday we did a really nice job with people who submitted yesterday's attendance sheet. We had 43 submissions, which was great. That's over 80%. And so just make sure that you keep submitting your attendance every single day, answering those journal prompts, because those are going to continue to be taken for a grade. A little bit later on this week, once we have kind of a clearer picture of what's going to happen in terms of the how long we're going to be out of school, we'll have a discussion and we'll talk about what we're going to do in terms of grading, because normally we could do our learning standards based grading, but that's when you're in the class with me and I have the opportunity to make sure that you're getting all the information that you need. Obviously with e-learning that's going to be a little bit more difficult, and so that might mean that we're going to need to kind of do a little bit more of a traditional grading system where it's just you're getting credit for doing your journal every day and doing the assignments, and you're just getting those points, which means that you're going to need to make sure that you stay on top of your assignment, because as you can see, and this is just for my social studies class only, I can't speak to either the other two classes, but if you look here on the second item there, only 7 people turned in their social studies assignment. And I know language arts, I put this into language arts classroom, and this is probably what most of you are expecting from me, but don't forget that you're going to have that social studies work too. And I will talk today about the assignment, preview the new unit, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page and we're going to continue to move forward. Because like I said yesterday, we have no idea how long we're going to be out, so we just kind of have to make the best of it. I will say as well, I am going to do my best to try and keep these shorter. I know yesterday came in a little bit over a half hour. I'd like to keep it down to more like 20 minutes, just so you all aren't spending all of your time having to watch this before you go into doing the rest of your work for your e-learning. All right, so yesterday's journal prompt was, if you could put yourself in the top 1% of society in any of these 3 categories, which would it be? Money, intelligence, or work ethic, and why? And so I picked some highlights, basically one for each answer. There were a lot of really good answers, so please don't be offended if I didn't pick yours. These are just 3 that I thought were interesting. And also, like I said, I picked one that went with each of the options. So we had one student write in, I would probably want to be in the top 1% for work ethic, because if you're known for your work, then I would be recognized for my work ethic, which would help me get recognized and could, help them get a better job, give them that flexibility. So I thought this was more interesting in terms of, taking that work ethic, but also making it in a way that you're going to better yourself as well. Then we had the second one, which was looking at money. This student said having a substantial amount of wealth would help with a lot of problems that people are going through, such as, lack of food, lack of housing. And then this student also mentioned that when they get older, they would be able to afford their own house, and some luxuries. I can tell you that if you're in the top 1% for wealth, you're not only going to be able to afford a house, you're going to be able to afford a pretty pretty darn nice house. But I thought, it is important. I thought this was a good response. You're helping problems that people are going through, but you're also looking out for yourself, which, I mean, at the end of the day, everybody's going to be doing that as well. And then finally, for intelligence, I just thought this was kind of funny. This person said that honestly, America could use a bit more common sense in general. And so if there were more intelligent people out there, if this person was a more, in that 1%, they would be able to help solve a lot of the problems dealing with a lot of the stressors and issues that people in society today are coping with. So things like, depression, stress, anxiety, etc. So those are just 3 highlights from our journal yesterday. We'll have a new one today. This one's going to be a little bit of more of a theme journal that we're going to be kind of rolling with for the next few days. So I will continue to bring in journal highlights every day. So again, if you didn't get chosen today, please don't take any offense to that. I'll try to choose different people every single day for these journal highlights because there were an awful lot of good ones. All right, so then today's plan, we'll look at our Google form, go over the journal prompt. We'll go over the Russian Revolution Prezi sheet from yesterday, and then once you're done with that, please turn that into Google Classroom. We're going to talk about allegory, which is a literary term that some of you might have heard of, but if not, you're going to learn about it today. And we'll go over how it relates to the book that we're going to read, Animal Farm. And then we will transition over to social studies. We'll talk about the assignment from yesterday, and then we'll just preview, make sure everyone knows that video 1 for our new unit and the notes are your social studies assignment for today. So let's jump on over here to our Google form, which, we already have 7 people who have responded. So our journal prompt for today, and actually I can just jump right over here to the journal slide deck. Again, apologies. Network's not going super fast with the live stream, but it is what it is. So today, our journal prompt number 56, my personal soundtrack. This is going to be the first in a series of journals where you are going to be creating a soundtrack for your life. So you're going to choose different songs for different purposes. You can choose songs that you're listening to now that are popular now. You can choose throwbacks, ones that your parents listened to, or I listened to when I was your age, or however far back you want to go. As long as you explain your choices, that's all that matters with these journals. So today, first journal for your soundtrack, you need a theme song. You need the song that captures you the best. So today's journal prompt is, what would be your theme song and then why? So some things to think about. Obviously, you can go with a song that you really enjoy. If you were to have a favorite song, then you could just say that's going to be my theme song. You could go for a song that really gets you, one that you think has a really positive message, or one that you wish to embody, a song that you think really paints a picture that you would like to be like, or you would like your life to be like. So for whatever purpose you choose, that's today's journal prompt. Theme song, what would it be and why? All right, so now let's jump over to the homework from yesterday, which was this Russian Revolution Prezi sheet. I said yesterday, don't worry about it if you didn't know every single answer. We're going to go over it today. So just if you want to open your assignment up in Google Classroom, if you submitted it, obviously if you want to unsubmit it first so that you can edit it, go ahead. I will just pause for a few seconds here. Actually, let me double check, see. It looks like everything's going okay today. Again, apologies for yesterday and that first live stream where it was just my face and then a white screen the whole time. I have the feed up and it looks like everything's looking all right. So that's good. Okay, so Russian Revolution, we talked about. This is looking at the period in Russia where we are looking at the time between World War I and World War II. That was what the Prezi from yesterday was all about. So we'll just kind of go through these questions. I might jump over to the Prezi itself just as a reference point, but most of these are pretty self-explanatory, and I'm sure you had no trouble finding them. So the Russian Revolution was actually composed of two revolutions that took place in 1917, and the main goal was to overthrow the ruler of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, and then to create a new government under communism. Then number 3, explain communism and why it was appealing. So communism, we talked about this with one of our word roots, con, with or together. Communism comes from the same word root as community, and it's a system where materials business is owned by the community at large as opposed to individuals. And so it was appealing to Russians during this time because most Russians were peasant workers, and communism offered the opportunity for a better life, more food, more wealth, and a more equal society. So in theory, communism would have been great for most of them. As you found out reading through the rest of the Prezi, it wasn't really so much the case all the time. Give 3 examples of why many Russians disagreed with Tsar Nicholas. He was a really poor leader. He had drafted 15 million Russian men to fight in World War I. I want to say it was something like 3 million of them died in the war. And all this time, he continued to live a life of luxury. He expected everyone to follow him blindly, to treat him like a saint, even though most of his people were suffering. So those are 3 of the examples. There were more on the Prezi itself, but those are 3 of the examples for why most Russians did not like Tsar Nicholas. In 1848, Karl Marx published a pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto, and in this pamphlet he urged the working class to rise up and revolt against the rich ownership class. This is a little bit, going back into the past. He had published this pamphlet, but then this idea of communism became much more popular during this time under Tsar Nicholas. So Karl Marx kind of considered like the father of communism. This is where it all started. So now we jump back into this time in Russia. Number 6, the first revolution was the February Revolution, where there were massive worker strikes in the capital. And when Tsar Nicholas called the military in for help, the troops actually turned against him and joined the strikers. And so Nicholas would abdicate or give up his throne on March 15th. So they were successful in getting him out. And then the second revolution was the October Revolution. This is number 7. The Bolshevik or the Communist Party had been gaining power, and they were led into this rebellion by a guy named Vladimir Lenin. And Vladimir Lenin is a figure that we will see in Animal Farm, obviously not himself, but as one of the animals, where he leads communism into power in Russia during this time. So number 8, after these revolutions, Lenin was the head of Russia until he died in 1924. And after his death, 2 men, Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky, competed to take his place. They were kind of the top dogs looking to gain that position of power. Stalin was a man of action, and he thought communism would only work in Russia, whereas Trotsky was more of a dreamer. He wanted to try and spread the word and the message of communism around the rest of the world. And so after a power struggle, Joseph Stalin would take control of the Communist Party and actually exile Trotsky from Russia, and later would have him executed. So now we're here on number 10. Stalin was a very corrupt ruler. He ruled with what could be described as an iron fist. One example that supports this is he organized the Great Purge between 1934 and 1939. That should be, here I can fix, look at that. Not 1393, 1939. Where millions of quote-unquote enemies of the working class were executed or arrested and thrown in jail. Obviously, we talked about Stalin when we talked about World War II. Not a good leader, no matter how you look at it. So this should be nothing new for all of you. Number 11, Stalin also controlled the Russian press. So there were articles. Every article was written to show him in a positive way. He also became the subject of songs and pieces of art in Russia. He even had his own name put into the national anthem. One of my favorite examples of just how far he would go. Number 12, Stalin would use the secret police like his secret enforcers. They weren't so much there to enforce the law, but to enforce loyalty to Stalin. He also used them as spies in other countries. They were given full power under the law, so most Russian citizens would greatly fear the secret police during this time. They were kind of Stalin's military arm, but not actually, part of the military. Number 13, Stalin used propaganda to make himself look like he was a great leader, the father of Russia. In all three of these examples, and I will jump here back into the Prezi just so you can see what I'm talking about. I want to say it's this bubble right here. Nope, just kidding. We'll jump forward. Oh no, jump back. I went too far. Ha! Right there. So here's our three examples of propaganda. You can see this one. He's got, the children are looking at him in a very positive light. He's, like the father figure. We have this one. He's standing at the head of all Russian people. They are clearly admiring him. Again, he's great. He's clearly standing out as the leader. And here, you have the soldiers there that he's standing behind as though he's at their back, even though obviously he was not actually out fighting himself. And then the one where he literally is holding a baby. I mean, what more could you want in terms of trying to make him look like the father of the Soviet Union? So those are just some of the examples of propaganda that Joseph Stalin used. They were not the only ones, but definitely emblematic of what it was like during this time. So now we're here on number 14. There was a famine in Russia from 1932 to 33, where anywhere from 5 to 10 million Russians died. Number 15 asked you to explain the working class versus the middle class under Stalin. The working class, which remember, in communism, the working class should be the class that really benefits because now they are part of the ownership class because it's given to the community as a whole, so they should be the ones who really benefit. But unfortunately, the working class in Russia continued to toil in unfair conditions. They weren't given much food. They had to work long hours. So things really were basically the same as they had been, if not worse, when Stalin took power. And then the middle class, they would have some of their wealth removed, but overall they still lived well enough and with enough fear of the secret police that no member of the middle class would dare to speak out against Stalin and the government. And surely they would not do anything to help the working class that could jeopardize themselves, cause them to be arrested, things like that. And then finally, and I'll scroll down. I can't scroll down a little bit more. I can see my face is blocking part of it, but the bold part that you need is still there, which is Stalin made an agreement with Germany, which was the non-aggression or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where both countries agreed to the land that they would take over. This was so that they could both become more powerful, own more land, but not step on each other's toes. And these invasions, as we talked about in social studies, would help launch World War II. So those were the examples, the answers from the Prezi sheet from yesterday. So obviously, if you need to go back, double check your answers. You can go back through once the stream is done. And then once you've filled out every question, go ahead and turn that into Google Classroom because you will be getting credit for that. All right. So now our next kind of prep activity that we're going to go into before we start actually reading Animal Farm is right here. We're on to another Prezi. If you can't tell, when I first made this unit, first introduced it into 8th grade language arts, we hadn't gone over to Chromebooks yet, so Prezi was kind of like the hot new presentation service. And so that's why if it seems like we're going a little heavy on Prezi, that'll explain why. So we are now looking at allegory in Animal Farm. And allegory is, as I mentioned, a literary device that plays a very important role in Animal Farm, and it's important to understand what allegory is because you're going to be asked to look for it while we read the story. And I'm looking over, like I said, I have the stream up. I'm going to do my best to make sure that my face isn't blocking out any of this information. So I apologize if I do for a moment, but I'll try and make sure that we have everything squared away so that you're good to go on allegory. All right, so what is allegory? Allegory, the definition, it's a story, a poem, a picture, any piece of art that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, which is usually a moral or a political one. All right, so if you look over on the left-hand side in that blue box, an example of allegory in old westerns, movies or stories, the sheriff usually represents this idea of good, and the outlaws usually represent this idea of evil. So that's just kind of a simple example of allegory. In Animal Farm, the characters and the events, as I said yesterday, are going to represent the Russian Revolution, which we were just talking about. So now that you know more about the Russian Revolution, you will be better prepared to identify, like, oh, this is just like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or, oh, I think this character represents Joseph Stalin, things like that. So we'll zoom in here. So authors use allegory to show hidden meanings in their work. And since allegories represent something in the real world, it tells the reader something about the real events. And so if you come over here, you might be asking, why did George Orwell, who's the author of Animal Farm, why did he use allegory in his story? Because Orwell was a major critic of Joseph Stalin and all the things that happened in Russia under Stalin's rule. So he wrote Animal Farm to show what was going on to anybody who read his story. But it was his way of combining, because he was an author, combining his interpretation and his commentary on Joseph Stalin with a story, and again, using animals, using a story that you're all going to be able to understand. It teaches you that much more about what was really going on, because hopefully you'll establish this connection and these feelings towards these characters, and then when you realize, well, wait, this character actually represents real people, it makes it that much more powerful. All right, so we'll go through here. Again, it looks like I didn't block anything out. So next one, why didn't Orwell just say Stalin was bad? Some of you might say, why is it authors always have to do all this extra stuff? Why didn't he just come out and write a report on why Joseph Stalin was such an awful leader? As all of you know, especially if you watch the news in any form, political arguments by nature are just very messy and very difficult to understand, especially if you don't have all the information. And as all of you know, political arguments are very polarizing. So it's easy to hear a political argument and just get automatically turned off because you think you're going to disagree with what the person's talking about. So, like I said, Orwell instead went with a story about farm animals, and because he was, in my opinion at least, a very good writer, he could get those emotions that he wanted to get you to understand and to feel a certain way about the Russian Revolution through what happens to the characters in the story. So that's a picture there of George Orwell. And so, again, this idea of allegory is one that plays literally throughout the whole story. So it's very, very important that you know what allegory means and be ready to look for it. So before we actually jump into reading Animal Farm, we're going to read another story, one that most of you have probably read. It is about animals, but that's just more of a kind of a coincidence. That is an allegory, and that is Yertle the Turtle by Dr. Seuss. And so I'm not going to play it here. That's your assignment for today. after you finish your journal prompt and after you finish watching this for language arts is to watch the story Yertle the Turtle. If you would like, you can listen to it. I've sent you a YouTube link of John Lithgow reading the story. It's not animated in the sense that it's like live action. It's more just kind of pictures flashing. And I also sent a hard copy of the story for you to read as well. And so your assignment today is to read or watch or listen to Yertle the Turtle and be thinking about what could be the allegory. What could the character Yertle the Turtle stand for? Because he stands for another political figure in history. So be thinking about what he does, his approach to other turtles, how he treats other turtles, and try and make a connection to a historical figure. It's one that I know all of you are familiar with. And so then tomorrow, hopefully everyone will have read or listened to the story, and we'll talk a little bit more about Yertle the Turtle as an allegory, and then we'll move forward into actually starting to read Animal Farm. All right, so that is your assignment for language arts today. Just getting to watch on YouTube, read some Dr. Seuss. What could be so bad about that? So I see we're already at about 26 minutes. Again, I apologize. I'm hoping to cut these down a little bit in the future. Just going over that Prezi sheet took a little bit longer. But for right now, why don't we transition over into social studies? All right, so I'm going to come over here. This was the social studies assignment that should have been shared out yesterday. I know I sent it out to my social studies class where I put you into groups because this would be a group activity normally if we were in class together. But instead, I just assigned it where each student was assigned one of these 4 sections. Like I said before, we only had 7 people out of 18 turn it in. If you were one of those people and you're watching, I would say please go back and unsubmit it. Well, first of all, I would say thank you very much for submitting your answers because I used those to provide this key for what this assignment should be. So if you couldn't see, our new unit, we just finished up with World War II. We are now talking about the civil rights era. And so before we start the unit itself, this introductory activity was meant to kind of remind us of the experience and the treatment of African Americans throughout the history of the United States. And so we looked at 4 separate time periods. And we, like I said, if you were in my class, you were assigned one of the 4 to read up on that certain era. I had linked an article about each one, and then there was one question to answer. And so now, as you're watching, or if you're watching later, you can go through and enter the other answers, or if you were someone who didn't do your work, all of the answers, and then you can turn this into Google Classroom as well. All right, so the first section that we talked about was the Revolutionary War. This is a throwback to when you all were in with Master McClure last year. And the question was, describe the early actions taken against slavery following the Revolutionary War. What stood in the way of African Americans gaining rights across the country? And I'll just leave the actual answer there on the screen. If you want to pause, write it down, you can. But in essence, Great Britain had always wanted to keep Africans separated from whites due to the color of their skin, but once the colonies gained independence, there were some abolitionists meaning wanting to end slavery, some abolitionist movements that were already coming about. And there were several states who created laws for themselves about abolishing or limiting slavery. But at the end of the day, because the southern states relied so much on slavery to uphold their economy, because their economy was based in agriculture and they needed that free labor force, slavery was actually written into as part of the U.S. Constitution. So that was the main things standing in the way. The fact that the South really wanted slavery and that it was written into the Constitution. One place, for example, would be the Three-Fifths Compromise. That was a challenge standing in the way of African Americans from the very beginning. All right, section 2 here is the Civil War. Let me make sure that I'm not, actually I can scroll down just a little bit more, make sure I'm not blocking any of the answer. The question was, describe the attitudes that Southerners had about slavery, which I'm sure all of you can remember. And then what new laws came about after the Civil War that gave new rights to African Americans. So obviously Southerners, for the most part, thought that slavery was okay. They needed this free labor force, and they didn't want slavery to be banned because there was a fear, which turned out to be accurate, that without it, the Southern economy would not be able to go on with the ways that it had created. And so obviously after the Civil War, we talked about the Emancipation Proclamation, which was actually still during the Civil War, and then the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed to the Constitution that banned slavery, made anybody born in the United States a citizen, and also gave African Americans the right to vote, African American men, I should say. So those were the laws after the Civil War that gave new rights to African Americans. And these were all born out of Abraham Lincoln having given the Emancipation Proclamation before. Then we'll come down here. Section 3 is that time period after the Civil War and into what's called the Jim Crow era. And the question was, describe the goals of the Jim Crow laws in the South. What were separate facilities like for whites and African Americans? And so for those of you who don't remember, because we did talk about this in a prior unit, Jim Crow laws, they created segregation and disenfranchisement for African Americans in the South. There was a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson that created this standing of, as long as facilities are quote unquote separate but equal, they are within the realm of the law. So this is why things like public bathrooms, buses, water fountains were all segregated. There was one for whites and one for non-whites. And so the second part of the question, what were the separate facilities like? Obviously, they were not in any way equal. They were much worse. They were not cared for. There was not money put into them. So separate but equal was the name of the law, but it was not the actual truth in terms of what was going on. And then finally, during World War II, the question was, describe the experiences of African American soldiers in World War II, and then what new plans did these veterans have after they returned home. This is actually a cut down. Thank you for the very, very thoughtful response, because this is really important to understand with the experiences of African Americans in World War II. All right, so we have I'm getting a warning here from YouTube that the video data is not coming in at a very fast rate. So I apologize if there's any buffering, if the sound's cut off. I know that the fact that yesterday during my live stream, I just listened to a little bit. I could tell that, the sound kind of cuts in and out. The video's not as fast as it can. Unfortunately, this is what we can do. So again, I apologize if any of you are going through any issues with the stream for those of you who are watching. So hopefully it'll be all right. So back here talking to the experiences of African Americans in World War II, there were more than 1 million African Americans who served. Unfortunately, they experienced a lot of unfriendliness, a lot of issues. They received fewer privileges. They were given kind of the worst jobs. But in their experiences in war, African Americans also got to see the treatment of people of color around the rest of the world. And so when they returned, many African American soldiers were determined to improve the life of African Americans in America. This is including making sure everyone got the right to vote, trying to do away with this whole separate but equal deal. And there were a number of African American soldiers who would become leading activists during the civil rights era. So those are the answers to this history of civil rights in America. For those of you who filled it out and put in your answers already, again, just make sure you unsubmit and you can fill out all the questions and turn this in. But thank you, because I did use your answers as a jumping off point, or in this last case as the whole answer for this key. So I really, really appreciate everyone putting in that time for social studies. All right, last thing now, in Google Classroom, I did assign the first part of the civil rights era outlines. One of the focuses I want to say while this opens up here is, even though the civil rights era, a lot of you, if you're familiar with it in any way, are used to thinking about the kind of leaders, the famous figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, Rosa Parks. You know, there are a lot of like big figures associated with the civil rights era. But as we're going to find out, the civil rights era was actually one where just more common people were able to stand up, have their voice heard, and try and make changes to this country. So even though there were some very, very powerful figures at its head, as you're going to see as we move forward, there are so many more stories to be told about the civil rights era outside of like those big names. And that's something that we'll look into as we go forward. I just wanted to kind of preview that because, you know, at this point, America had been a country for almost 200 years. It had been basically 100 years since the Civil War had ended, and yet people of color in the United States were still treated as like a completely different class of human being from whites. And so time finally had come where people were going to stand up, changes were going to come to the laws, and you'll see that moving forward. So this is a copy of the outlines for this unit. I've also sent the YouTube link for my video on these, so just go ahead, watch, because you haven't gotten enough of me on YouTube for today. That is your social studies assignment, to go through, watch, and fill out your notes. And then tomorrow, our time will be going through those notes and making sure that everything we've got is copied down. Now, I know I would just say, again, I can only speak to my class, but just in general, really try to make sure, please, 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 that you stay caught up on these notes and take really good notes, because trying to do this again through distance learning is just going to be that much more challenging. And I know that it's very easy to want to just push this off, but this is what we've got. And like I said, you know, myself and the other 8th grade teachers, we're going to try and make this as good as we can for you. We're just hoping that we can count on you to meet us halfway and continue to put forward all that good effort that you had before. All right, so language arts, make sure you fill out that Russian Revolution Prezi sheet if you did not. Answer your journal prompt, and then just watch Turtle the Turtle. Enjoy. And then civil rights era outlines for social studies, part 1, the beginnings of the civil rights era. And make sure that you fill out the other assignment and turn that into Google Classroom as well. All right. Looking over here at the chat, I appreciate the hype, Dayton. No one else with anything for today, that's all right. In the future, for those of you who are tuning in, and again, I don't know how many, I know I can find that, but just, yeah, I understand if the audio quality is not great, or if you can't get on, whatever. But if you have questions in real time, go ahead and please ask them. Paige, when do you want the Genius Hour sheet turned in? If you're talking about the introductory sheet, we're going to go over that actually a little bit more tomorrow. So as long as you have picked your topic and then your essential question and sent that in tonight, I'm going to be going through giving people feedback on that, and then updating the sheet with everyone's topic choices, sending people feedback. And then tomorrow for part of the class, we'll go over the next steps in Genius Hour. But we've done Genius Hour once already. If you are wanting to fill out the rest of the sheets, start doing your research, obviously, like I said yesterday, I think that that's one of the great things about Genius Hour is it's a project that you can just kind of go forward at your own pace and work on while we are here doing our e-learning. Mrs. James, I appreciate. I've been working really hard on my eye contact. I don't have any note cards. I will say I can tell that I use a lot of filler words here. I'll be honest, it is a little awkward talking into the webcam, but hopefully I'll get used to it the more we practice it. So thank you to everyone who did their assignment yesterday, turned in those journal prompts. I'll be reading those again tonight. We'll have another online class tomorrow, and then we'll just move forward from there. And thank you everyone else for watching. Until then, don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions today. But until tomorrow, this has been Professor Blazek, and I will see you next time.